Hello, my fellow paranormal enthusiast. You have made your way to Renegade Files, your covert connection to strange events, unexplained encounters, and the shadows that stretch across history. I'm your host, Lex Gordon, coming to you from the Jungle Villa Outpost, deep in the uncharted tropics. This is Renegade Files, episode 103, The Roswell UFO Incident, Part 1. If you've been into Renegade Files for a while, you know that Roswell has hovered over this show like a silent craft in the desert night. It is the cornerstone of modern UFO lore, the gravitational center around which decades of sightings, investigations, debunkings, and disclosures all orbit. And for good reason. The Roswell event wasn't just another one of those odd little stories tucked away in the dusty corners of the 1940s. It was the very genesis of the modern UFO movement. This episode has been a long time coming. You know, I've talked about doing it, and I've always wanted to cover Roswell, but I wanted the Renegade Files audience to be large enough, invested enough, and curious enough to take this journey the way it deserves to be taken. And now, with the show growing and modern disclosure efforts dragging official secrets into the light, and with a Pentagon UFO report that somehow managed to avoid mentioning Roswell at all, the time feels perfect. This is a big one, a watershed topic that has endured because the official stories are harder to believe than the conspiracy theories. At first glance, some may think, why do Roswell? What can be said that hasn't been said already? As it turns out, a lot. With every year, another layer of realization comes to light. When this story first gained traction, the idea of the government lying to the people was a fringe idea. How about now? Tonight, we begin a two-part investigation into the most iconic UFO case on Earth. This episode is part 1, and it will set the stage and take us through the chain of events leading up to the official investigation into whatever crashed on a farm outside Roswell, New Mexico. Then, next Wednesday, in part 2, we'll follow the fallout, the cover stories, the witnesses, the cultural shifts, and the strange silence that wrapped itself around this event for decades. Roswell sits at the collision point of post-war secrecy, nuclear age anxiety, newly observed flying saucers streaking across American skies, and the birth of a media frenzy unlike anything the world had ever seen. So settle in now, listen closely, and come with me into one of the biggest episodes and deepest dives ever on Renegade Files. Together, we will explore this most astounding event where the modern UFO mystery begins on Renegade Files, episode 103, The Roswell UFO Incident, Part 1. The Roswell UFO Incident, Part 1. So this is one of those episodes where I'm going to give you a little production disclaimer in the beginning. This show is a giant. It is an enormous body of research, work, and investigation. No stone unturned, a lot of hours, and it's going to be a big episode, even though it's part 1. This is a huge subject. What's important here is this story. And rather than call these part 1, part 2, part 3 as we go through the body of this work, I've chosen a new naming convention because the show is part 1 and it has a part 2. So just to kind of avoid confusion, and it's also just for the fun of it, we're going to name these sections File 1, File 2, and File 3, keeping with our top secret investigation vibe. So I hope you're ready. This is a huge one, long time coming, and let's get into it. File 1. The Ominous Prelude. In the months and years leading up to the Roswell incident of 1947, the United States was living through one of the most transformative periods in its history. The world had just emerged from the devastation of the Second World War, a conflict so vast and brutal that it reshaped nations, societies, economies, and entire worldviews. America and the Allies had come out of the war victorious, but not unchanged. Beneath the celebrations and optimism lay a deeper undercurrent of unease. A realization that the very technologies that had ended the war had also unlocked frightening new possibilities. The country was stepping into an era defined not just by progress, but by a lingering sense that the world was becoming something fundamentally different, especially from the one of earlier generations. The defining symbol of this shift occurred on July 16, 1945, in the deserts of New Mexico. The Trinity test, the first detonation of a nuclear weapon on Earth, was carried out in a stretch of land not far from where the events of the Roswell crash would unfold 2 years later. In that moment, when the bomb released its blinding flash and rising column of fire, humanity crossed a threshold. Those who witnessed it firsthand described it as awe-inspiring and horrifying at the same time. The scientists who created the bomb were shaken by what they saw, and military officials, though impressed by its power, understood immediately that a new type of war and a new type of global power was taking shape. The Trinity test wasn't only a military experiment. It was a symbolic moment for the entire planet. The shockwave of that event rippled across science, politics, philosophy, and culture. To some, it felt like the start of a new era of possibility, and to others, it signaled that humanity had taken a dangerous step toward its own destruction. And in the years since, many theorists and researchers have suggested that such a sudden leap in destructive capability could have attracted attention far beyond Earth. Attention from observers who had been watching humanity's development with curiosity or caution. Whether such ideas are speculation or something more, the timing is impossible to ignore. The world's first nuclear explosion, carried out in the same region of the country where the Roswell story soon emerged, became one of the earliest links between nuclear activity and unidentified flying objects. In the immediate aftermath of the war, the United States found itself adjusting to a dramatically changing landscape. Soldiers were returning home. Industries were shifting back to peacetime production, and families were rebuilding their lives. Yet the memory of global conflict was very fresh. The war had proven just how quickly the world could be thrown into chaos, and how rapidly technology could advance when nations were competing for survival. This realization left many Americans uneasy. The victory had come at an enormous cost, and the emergence of new geopolitical tensions ensured that peace felt fragile. Within months of the war's end, relations between the United States and the Soviet Union began to deteriorate. Both nations were racing to secure technological and military advantages. Secrets were guarded tightly, and the fear of espionage or surprise attack began to shape policy, communication, and public consciousness. The period became the early foundation of what would soon be known as the Cold War. It was a time marked by suspicion, preparation, and a growing belief that unseen threats could emerge without warning. Newspapers and radio programs reported frequently on political maneuvering, nuclear research, and the uneasy state of global affairs. In homes across the country, families discussed the possibility of future conflicts, the power of new weapons, and the sense that the world was inching towards something unknown. Many built their own bomb shelters. This mix of optimism and dread created a national mood that was highly receptive to stories of unexplained events or strange sightings. The idea that something unusual might be happening in the skies above us was no longer unthinkable, it was almost expected. The rapid pace of technological advancement added to the sense of uncertainty. During the war, aircraft design had evolved dramatically, with planes flying faster, higher, and farther than anyone had ever imagined possible just a decade earlier. Radar systems, once experimental, were now a standard part of military operations. Rockets and missiles were under development, and scientists were already thinking about the potential of space travel. To younger Americans, this progress was exciting. To older generations, who had grown up without electricity or automobiles, the change felt disorienting. These were people who had lived through times when a horse and wagon were the primary means of transportation, when communication relied on handwritten letters, and the possibility of a powered flying machine was still up for debate. For these people, the appearance of roaring aircraft overhead, moving at speeds previously unthought of, seemed unnatural and even threatening. Many distrusted these new machines and the technological acceleration they represented. This generational divide played a quiet but important role in shaping the public's perceptions of UFO sightings. Older Americans were more likely to be unsettled by unfamiliar objects in the sky, while younger people were more inclined to be excited and interpret such events through the lenses of science, innovation, and possibility. Amid these cultural tensions, the American Southwest was becoming a hub for cutting-edge research, secrecy, and advanced technology. White Sands Proving Ground, soon to be known as Area 51, hosted tests of missiles, rockets, and experimental aircraft. Many of the country's brightest scientists and strategists worked in this region. Nuclear research facilities were scattered across the landscape, and high-clearance air bases operated in near total secrecy. Air traffic in the area included experimental craft, captured foreign equipment, and prototype technologies that had not yet been revealed to the public. The combination of clear skies, flat, open desert terrain, and military isolation made New Mexico the perfect testing ground for governmental projects that had to be hidden from foreign powers. As these developments unfolded, the American public was gradually becoming more aware of the world being full of secrets. Stories circulated about classified projects, unusual aircraft sightings, and government facilities operating behind chain-link fences and security gates. People understood instinctively that the military was probably working on technology far beyond what had been revealed. And with this understanding came a mixture of pride and paranoia. Citizens were proud of the nation's progress, but uneasy about what that progress might lead to. They trusted the military was protecting them, but they feared what might happen if certain weapons or experiments were mishandled. Across the country, the idea of unidentified flying objects was starting to take hold. Strange aerial sightings were being reported more frequently, often described in ways that didn't match known aircraft. Pilots, radar operators, and civilians alike described objects moving too fast, too erratically, or too quietly to fit the profile of conventional machines. And remember, we're talking about the 1940s here. Newspapers picked up these stories, sometimes treating them seriously and other times using them as a filler for slow news days. But even when the tone was dismissive, the cumulative effect was clear. People were looking upward, wondering what might be moving through the sky. And so, as the summer of 1947 approached, the atmosphere in New Mexico and across the nation was charged with a unique combination of possibility and uncertainty. The world had changed more in the previous decade than in a century before that. Technology was reshaping everything from transportation to warfare. The government was managing an unprecedented number of classified programs. Families were listening to nightly broadcasts about global tensions and scientific breakthroughs. And in the minds of many Americans, especially those who remembered life before airplanes or electricity, the pace of change was unsettling. The idea of something unearthly visiting the planet suddenly didn't seem as far-fetched as it once had. It was in this environment that New Mexico became the center of some of the most intriguing events of the post-war era. The vast open desert provided a sense of isolation, but it was far from empty. The roads and railways connected small towns with military installations. Ranchers and homesteaders worked lands that sometimes bordered top-secret testing areas. Scientists drove into the desert in unmarked vehicles, carrying equipment for experiments that the public would not hear about for decades. And in the air above, machines that seemed, to many who watched, like glimpses of a future that was arriving too early. The combination of nuclear experimentation, military secrecy, rapid technological expansion, and a population divided between excitement and distrust created an ideal setting for extraordinary reports. By early 1947, America was still adjusting to the new reality of living in a nuclear age. Schools performed air raid drills. Political leaders debated strategies for a potential future conflict, and scientists continued to push the limits of what technology could achieve. This widespread curiosity, and in some cases, quiet fear, formed the backdrop against which the Roswell events would soon unfold. The people of New Mexico were already accustomed to seeing unusual aircraft and hearing rumors of classified work being carried out in the desert. They lived close to missile ranges, nuclear laboratories, and air bases where advanced prototypes were tested. Their skies were busy with machines that flew outside the region and they never saw them again. This environment made them more observant, more alert to strange occurrences, and more aware that something new and unfamiliar could appear at any time. Yet even with all this activity, nothing prepared the public for the events that would occur in the summer of 1947. The Trinity nuclear test had shown the world that humanity was capable of harnessing incredible power. The war had proven that global events could change overnight. The Cold War had demonstrated that secrecy was as valuable a weapon as any bomb or aircraft. The rapid pace of technology had shown that the unimaginable could become real almost overnight. All of these forces were converging, shaping the public's expectations, fears, and imagination. As rumors increased, many Americans felt that the world was on the brink of another revelation, one that might come from the sky rather than from a laboratory or a battlefield. In this charged atmosphere, every unexplained light, every unusual sound, and every whispered rumor carried more weight than it might have in a more peaceful time. People were watching the skies with a mixture of hope and apprehension. They wondered whether the world was entering a new era of discovery or stepping into a future filled with new dangers. and in the desert towns of New Mexico, where the memories of Trinity were still fresh, and where the horizon stretched as wide as the biggest imagination, the stage was set. The conditions were in place for an event that would spark decades of speculation, investigation, and controversy. The people living in this region during that time didn't know it yet, but they were standing at the edge of a story that would become one of the most enduring mysteries in American history. If you enjoy these investigations and want to help keep this independent show alive, join me at the Renegade Files Agency on Patreon. Your support there directly funds what I have to do to make this show, and it helps me keep the show ad-free and fiercely independent for now. Every new agent there gets bonus content, the dark intel files containing all of the research and photos and documents from every episode, and secret dispatches from me. All of this only available to the RFA agents on Patreon. But more than that, you become part of a very important group of listeners who make this show possible. If you believe in digging deeper, questioning the narrative, and keeping truth alive, then join me at patreon.com/renegadefiles. There's a link in the show notes. And become an agent today. You can try it there for free for an entire week with no obligation. Check it all out. And thank you to the RFA agents there already. You have my heartfelt gratitude. File 2. Flying Saucers Arrive. On June 24th, 1947, a private pilot named Kenneth Arnold took off on what should have been an ordinary flight. Arnold was a businessman from Boise, Idaho, an experienced aviator, and the owner of a small fire extinguisher company. He was dependable, technically minded, and calm under pressure. Qualities that would become important in the story that followed him for the rest of his life. That afternoon, as he flew near Mount Rainier in Washington state, Kenneth Arnold saw something in the sky that he could not explain. Something that would capture the imagination of the nation and give rise to a phrase that became inseparable from the UFO phenomenon. Kenneth Arnold was flying his Cal Air A2, a light, single-engine aircraft, in clear weather with excellent visibility. He was searching the area for a missing Marine Corps transport plane, believed to have crashed in the mountains. This was a normal thing for him. He often assisted local authorities and rescue teams when aircraft went down in the rugged terrain of the Pacific Northwest. His reputation was that of a level-headed professional who took his responsibilities seriously. He was not the kind of man prone to fantasy or exaggeration. As Arnold passed near Mount Rainier, he noticed a strange sequence of bright flashes to his left. Assuming they were reflections from another aircraft, he scanned the sky for the source, but what he saw was unlike any planes he had ever encountered. Moving in a tight formation were 9 objects shaped like crescents or boomerangs. They were flat, thin, and gleamed in the sunlight. They flew at a tremendous speed, darting between the peaks of the Cascade Mountains in a fashion that seemed to defy known aviation capabilities. Arnold estimated their speed at over 1,200 miles per hour, way faster than any aircraft publicly known to exist at the time. Arnold described their motion as exceptionally smooth yet rapid. What struck him most was the peculiar way they moved. They didn't glide or bank like conventional aircraft. Instead, he said they skipped across the sky as if ricocheting off of invisible waves. When he later spoke to reporters, he tried to explain this unusual motion using an analogy. He said the flight motion looked like thrown saucers skipping across a pond surface, kind of fluttering. He was describing the movement, not the shape, but a reporter used the phrase flying saucers in his article, and a modern term was born. This description spread like wildfire. Within 24 hours, newspapers across the country were printing headlines about flying saucers speeding across the skies of Washington. Journalists, whether intentionally or out of misunderstanding, described Arnold's objects as literal round discs, like saucers, even though he had explained otherwise. The phrase was catchy, memorable, and evocative, and it became the default label for unidentified aerial craft from that moment forward. This linguistic twist changed everything. If the press had referred to Arnold's sighting using a more technical or accurate description, such as crescent-shaped or unidentified flying boomerangs, the entire cultural lexicon might look different today. But flying saucers stuck. It struck a chord with the public imagination, and once that phrase appeared in print, it was impossible to contain. What made the story even more compelling was Kenneth Arnold himself. He wasn't an obscure witness, he was a skilled pilot with thousands of hours of flight experience and a respected businessman and someone deeply familiar with aircraft. When he spoke about what he saw, he did so plainly and without exaggeration. He provided precise measurements, described the object's movements thoughtfully, and consistently stated what he had seen and what he did and didn't know. His sincerity made a strong impression on the journalists who interviewed him. Some even remarked on how rational and credible he seemed. But in the wave of excitement and skepticism that followed, Arnold found himself caught in the crossfire of public opinion. For many ordinary Americans, his sighting confirmed what they already suspected. Something strange was happening in the skies. But for others, especially an establishment seeking to maintain control, Kenneth Arnold became a target. Some newspapers portrayed him as confused, unreliable, or overly imaginative. A few went further and depicted him in caricatures as a wide-eyed yokel claiming to see little green men, even though Arnold never suggested anything of the sort. This ridicule was not accidental. In 1947, anything that challenged official narratives or suggested phenomena beyond known science was met with resistance. The easiest path for skeptics was to attack the witness. Despite the skepticism, Arnold's report unleashed a wave of UFO sightings across the country. In the days and weeks following his experience, hundreds of similar reports flooded police stations, newspapers, and military bases. People described seeing discs, crescents, ovals, and glowing orbs moving at impossible speeds or performing maneuvers that no aircraft could match. Many UFO sightings came from pilots, radar operators, and trained observers whose testimonies were difficult to dismiss. The simple truth was that Americans were seeing things in the sky that did not fit any known category. The timing of Arnold's sighting was critical. The nation was still living in the shadow of the Trinity nuclear test and the atomic bombings of the war. Confidence in science was high, but so were anxieties about the rapid changes transforming society. The idea that mysterious craft were flying through American airspace resonated with a population already uneasy about the state of the world. These sightings also placed new pressure on the U.S. military. They were expected to maintain control of the skies and explain any unusual activity. Yet many of these new reports could not be easily explained. The military, like the public, was grappling with something unknown. Newspaper editors realized that stories about flying saucers sold papers. Headlines speculated wildly about the nature of the objects that Kenneth Arnold saw. Some reporters hinted at secret Soviet technology. Others implied extraterrestrial origins. The growing interest in flying saucers also had another more subtle influence. It began to shape how Americans imagined the unknown. Before Arnold's sighting, stories of mysterious craft visiting Earth were largely confined to pulp magazines and fringe literature. Most considered these tales harmless entertainment, disconnected from real science or genuine speculation. But once the phrase flying saucers entered the national vocabulary, the line between entertainment and possibility blurred. Suddenly, the idea that strange craft might be visiting Earth didn't seem entirely fictional. It seemed, at the very least, like a question worth asking. But the more the idea of flying saucers appeared in comic strips, radio skits, and novelty stories, the easier it became for skeptics to dismiss real sightings as products of the imagination. In this way, early science fiction played a dual role. It sparked interest in the unknown while simultaneously allowing the establishment to downplay the legitimacy of unexplained phenomena. Kenneth Arnold's sighting marked a turning point. It demonstrated that highly trained observers could witness objects that defied explanation. Whether these objects were military aircraft, misidentified natural events, or something beyond the scope of earthly technology, it was clear that the nation had entered a new era of aerial mystery. As more reports came in, the military response became a mixture of investigation and containment, with officers attempting to learn what they could while controlling the narrative presented to the public. Kenneth Arnold always stood by his account. He was consistent in every interview and resisted attempts to sensationalize the story. His integrity won him respect from many researchers and aviation experts, even as some segments of the press continued to mock him. Over time, Kenneth Arnold became something of an accidental pioneer in the UFO studies. He never asked for the role, but his sighting became the reference point for countless investigations that followed. In this environment, the conditions were perfectly set for what would soon happen in New Mexico. The Kenneth Arnold sighting had primed the nation to believe that extraordinary sightings might be occurring. The wave of follow-up reports confirmed that unusual things were not isolated incidents. Public curiosity, military concern, and media enthusiasm all converged. The country was watching, questioning, and waiting for answers. And in early July, when news emerged that something strange had happened on a ranch near Roswell, New Mexico, it landed on a primed public. The Kenneth Arnold sighting had made flying saucers a national obsession. The events soon to unfold in Roswell would turn that obsession into a legend. File 3. A Crash in the Night. In the first days of July 1947, the high plains of New Mexico were swept by a series of violent thunderstorms. The summer storm season was beginning, and thunderstorms in that region were known to roll across the landscape with sudden fury. On one such night, as wind and rain tore across the Foster Ranch northwest of Roswell, New Mexico, rancher Mac Brazel heard a sound unlike anything he had heard in all his years living and working in the desert. Whether it was an explosion, a tremendous crash, or some other disturbance, he could not say with certainty. He knew it wasn't thunder or gunfire. It was something else. Something unusual enough that he remembered it distinctly in the days that followed. Brazel was a capable and observant man. Born in 1899, he had spent much of his life working ranches in the remote stretches of New Mexico, a landscape that rewarded self-reliance and an intimate understanding of nature. He wasn't known for exaggeration or storytelling. He wasn't the sort of person who sought attention or imagined extraordinary explanations for ordinary things. He lived simply, worked hard, and kept to himself. When he heard that strange noise in early July, he didn't think much of it at first. Storms did strange things on the plains. Sounds could carry for miles, and echoes played tricks in the ears. Maybe lightning had struck a rocky outcropping, and the combination of the strike and the exploding rock had caused an unusually powerful blast. But in the coming days, when he came across unusual debris scattered across his grazing land, the memory of that sound took on a new significance. On the morning of July 3rd, Brazel rode out to check his sheep after a storm. As he moved across the ranch, he noticed that several of the animals were behaving nervously. They refused to cross a particular stretch of pasture, something they normally navigated without hesitation. Their agitation struck him as unusual. Sheep often reacted to predators or the lingering effects of a bad storm, but this seemed different. When he rode closer to investigate, he found the field littered with strange material. The debris covered a very wide area, reportedly hundreds of feet across. Brazel dismounted and examined the fragments more closely. What he saw puzzled him deeply. The pieces were unlike anything he had encountered on the ranch, and they didn't resemble parts of any known aircraft. Some fragments were thin, metallic sheets that felt almost weightless. When he bent or crumpled them, they returned to their original shape without creasing. Others were small beams or rods, extremely light, yet unusually strong. Some with strange markings or symbols etched or printed along their length. There were also bits of foil-like substance that shimmered in the sunlight and refused to tear. Nothing he found burned, splintered, or broke in any way familiar to him. Brazel collected several samples and continued surveying the debris field, becoming increasingly convinced that something out of the ordinary had happened. Whatever had fallen there didn't match the appearance of a plane crash or a weather balloon wreckage, both of which he had seen in his day. The pieces appeared deliberately manufactured, but not with any technology he could recognize. After gathering what fragments he could carry, he returned home, deep in thought. Over the next day or two, Brazel shared what he had found with a few people he trusted, including neighbors who lived on nearby ranches. Among those who were shown the debris were the Proctors, a local ranching family. Loretta Proctor recalled years later that the pieces Brazel brought to her home were light, metallic, and unlike anything she had ever seen. She remembered one piece in particular, a small beam with odd, almost hieroglyphic-like markings on it. She and her husband encouraged Brazel to show the debris to the authorities in Roswell, believing that, whatever it was worth reporting. Another early figure in the chain of events was radio operator and station manager Frank Joyce of KGFL in Roswell. According to Joyce's later accounts, Brazel had contacted the radio station at some point before he went to the sheriff. Frank Joyce remembered Brazel sounding confused and uneasy about what he had found. The rancher wasn't prone to exaggeration, and Joyce took notice of the seriousness in his tone. Their conversation, as Joyce recalled, suggested that Brazel felt a responsibility to report the discovery, but he was uncertain how officials might react. It was this uncertainty, coupled with the peculiar nature of the debris, that ultimately led Brazel to make the decision that would place him at the center of one of the most enduring mysteries of the 20th century. On July 6, 1947, Brazel traveled into Roswell and brought samples of the debris to Sheriff George Wilcox. Wilcox was a respected lawman who had served the community for years. Like Brazel, he wasn't prone to sensational thinking, and he approached matters with a level, methodical mindset. He was a sheriff. When Brazel laid out the pieces he had collected, Wilcox found them strange enough to warrant escalation. After examining the fragments, he contacted the Roswell Army Airfield, the RAAF, which was the nearest military installation. Sheriff Wilcox's involvement has become an important part of the story, not only because of his decision to alert the military, but because of the claims that emerged in the years that followed. According to some accounts, primarily from family members and individuals who spoke with Wilcox privately, he may have seen more than just debris. Some later reports tell us that Wilcox visited the crash site and that he encountered not only unusual material, but a crashed craft embedded into the terrain, and actual bodies of beings that, according to him, were not human. He was allegedly very disturbed by what he saw, and according to some, he was threatened by military officials to remain silent. These stories are the first in the timeline that allude to the imposed secrecy that quickly formed around this event. The military response was swift. The Roswell Army Airfield, the RAAF, sent out intelligence officer Major Jesse Marcel and a cleanup detail to investigate the site. But before Marcel arrived, other testimonies suggest that additional military personnel may have reached the area. One of the most significant of these testimonies came years later from Sergeant Melvin E. Brown, a soldier stationed at Roswell at the time of the incident. Brown stated that he was part of a convoy sent to retrieve materials from the crash site and that he had seen, under a tarp, in the back of a truck, the bodies of beings that did not appear to be human. This corroborates Sheriff Wilcox's accounts of alien creatures at the crash site. Brown's family members later recounted that he described seeing beings with large heads, unusual eyes, and very small frames. The consistency of Brown's statements to multiple family members has made them a notable part of the Roswell narrative. Another significant testimony comes from Roswell mortician Glenn Dennis. At the time of the incident, Dennis was a young employee at the Ballard Funeral Home, which had a contract with the Roswell Army Airfield for mortuary services. According to Dennis, he received a series of unusual phone calls from the military base shortly after the crash, asking detailed questions about child-sized caskets, embalming chemicals, and tissue preservation. When Dennis later visited the base hospital, he claimed that a nurse he knew confided in him that she had witnessed autopsy procedures being performed on non-human bodies recovered from the crash. Dennis said the nurse disappeared shortly afterward, and that he was warned by military officials not to discuss what he had learned. We do know that Dennis changed the name of this alleged nurse at least once in retellings of the events, and this has made his credibility controversial, but his tale has remained one of the most widely cited civilian testimonies related to the early days of the Roswell event. And once again, this would be the third instance of people reporting alien bodies at the Roswell crash. And remember, this was very early on. These accounts, those of Brazel, the Proctors, Joyce, Wilcox, Brown, and Dennis, form the backbone of what researchers refer to as the initial crash phase of the Roswell incident. They provide a snapshot of the days immediately surrounding the discovery of the debris field and establish a timeline leading up to the military's full involvement. Most of these early witnesses lived quiet, practical lives, and their descriptions of events were delivered plainly, without theatrics or embellishment. Just as importantly, none of them had a cultural framework for inventing elaborate scenarios involving extraterrestrial beings. Not much, anyway. In 1947, science fiction cinema was still in its infancy. The concept of alien visitors had not yet become a common trope in movies, television, or literature. The idea that ranchers, morticians, and small-town sheriffs would spontaneously invent such a narrative stretches plausibility. What further strengthens the case for their sincerity is the consistency with which they describe the material found at the crash site. The debris was repeatedly characterized as lightweight, metallic, and unlike anything familiar. The so-called memory metal, which returned to its shape after being bent or crushed, was mentioned by multiple witnesses independently. The beams with unusual markings appeared in more than one account, and the sheer quantity of debris described by those who saw it firsthand suggested that whatever had fallen on the Foster Ranch covered a very large area and disintegrated in a manner not typical of a conventional aircraft. And remember the radio operator, Frank Joyce, who spoke early on with Mac Brazel about the debris he found? Well, when he began reporting the story on his radio show, he suddenly encountered what he described as an atmosphere of tension that developed quickly at the station. According to him, after one of his shows, he received a phone call from some unnamed official at the Pentagon. This mysterious individual issued a stern warning to Frank Joyce, telling him to avoid broadcasting anything further about the UFO crash at Roswell. Joyce was told that if he persisted in reporting on the subject, his radio station's broadcasting license would be revoked immediately. This was a warning that Joyce took seriously enough to comply with completely. Other secondary witnesses emerged over the years, many of them locals who reported seeing increased military activity around the area in July. Some described convoys of trucks moving through the town late at night, or soldiers in the fields near the Foster Ranch. Still others recalled hearing rumors of unusual cargo being transported to the base, including large crates or sealed containers. While not all of these accounts can be verified, the volume of testimony and the consistency of the timeline lend weight to the idea that something significant was happening at the Roswell Ranch. It is also worth noting the speed with which the military moved once Brazel contacted Sheriff Wilcox. The RAAF was home to the 509th Bomb Group, the only nuclear-capable bomber unit in the world at the time. Its leadership and personnel were trained to respond rapidly to potential threats, and their intelligence division was one of the most sophisticated in the country. The fact that they reacted immediately to Brazel's report, dispatching officers and retrieval teams, suggests that they recognized the potential significance of the debris. Whether they believed it might be foreign technology, an advanced experimental aircraft, or something of their own that had gone off track, the response indicated that the matter was taken seriously from the outset. As Major Jesse Marcel and the recovery team prepared to examine the site firsthand, the atmosphere in Roswell shifted. Word of the strange debris circulated quietly among civilians who had seen or heard about it. Some speculated that it might be a crashed aircraft of foreign origin. Others wondered whether the material came from a secret military project. A few, influenced by the wave of flying saucer sightings triggered by Kenneth Arnold's report, began to connect the dots. For the first time, the idea that the crash might be related to the mysterious objects seen across the country began to take shape in the local imagination. More witnesses came forward, more details emerged, and the story expanded into the broader narrative that we recognize today. The testimonies of those early witnesses continue to be among the most compelling aspects of the Roswell incident, precisely because they come from people who had no reason to invent extraordinary claims and no cultural incentive to interpret the event in terms of extraterrestrial visitation. At this point, we have the crash debris discovery, the immediate witnesses, the early interpretations of what they found, and the sudden involvement of the military authorities. It is a story grounded in credible accounts from people who lived simple, honest lives far removed from the world of science fiction or national intrigue. Their voices, preserved through interviews and recollections, remain among the most compelling elements of the Roswell case. They form the foundation upon which all subsequent investigations, debates, and theories have been built. And as the narrative moves forward in the deeper military involvement in this event, the original testimonies anchor the story in the experiences of those who were there when something strange fell from the sky onto a quiet ranch in New Mexico. File 4. The Military Command. When Sheriff George Wilcox contacted the RAAF on July 6, 1947, he did so with the tone of a man acting out of responsibility rather than alarm. The material that rancher Mac Brazel had shown him was strange enough to warrant official attention, and in that part of New Mexico, the military was the final authority on anything unusual found in the desert. When the call arrived that debris had been found northwest of town, the base responded the way it responded to everything, by sending someone competent, calm, and trained to sort out fact from confusion. That someone was Major Jesse Marcel, the base's chief intelligence officer. Marcel was a respected figure on the base, and a methodical thinker with experience in intercepting and analyzing foreign technology. His work required an ability to identify materials, evaluate wreckage, and determine whether something posed a strategic threat. The sheriff's description of the debris was vague, but unusual enough that General William H. Butch Blanchard, the commanding officer at Roswell, authorized Marcel to conduct a field assessment. The assignment was treated as routine, a goodwill gesture as much as an intelligence duty. Marcel and the small team accompanying him were likely told that this was probably nothing more than a weather device or debris carried by the storm. Reassure the sheriff, collect the debris, and write a report, and then move on. When Marcel and his team arrived at the debris field, the scale of the scene surprised them. The wreckage was scattered over an area far larger than expected from something like a balloon crash or an equipment drop. As they stepped out into the field, the wind carried the faint scent of rain from the previous night's storm. The debris glittered across the ground, catching the afternoon sunlight. Marcel bent down to examine the nearest piece and immediately realized that he was not looking at anything conventional. He lifted a sheet of thin metallic foil. It was far lighter than anything he had handled before, almost weightless. When he compressed it in his hand, it crumpled, but as he released it, it returned instantly to its original gleaming shape, showing no dents or creases. He turned the piece over, looking for seams or manufacturing marks, but he found none. Other fragments nearby included small beams that looked as if they were metallic, very light, but surprisingly strong. They bore markings, purple geometric symbols, shapes that struck him as unfamiliar and distinctly non-alphabetic. The metal beams and foil sheets seemed to have no rivets, welds, or joints. Everything appeared to have been molded or formed as part of a single structure. As Marcel walked the length of the debris field, his confidence that this was a routine assignment evaporated. The material, in both its appearance and composition, did not match any known terrestrial aircraft or weather device. He gathered several samples, careful not to disturb the area more than necessary, and he spoke with Mac Brazel at length. The rancher explained the loud and unusual explosion he had heard, how his sheep refused to cross parts of the pasture where the debris had been found, and how he had never seen anything remotely similar in all his years of working that land. As Marcel examined the fragments, he felt a quiet uncertainty building in him. This was no weather balloon, no aircraft, and no known piece of military equipment. Marcel made the decision to return to the base with selected pieces of the debris while leaving the site intact for further recovery efforts. He took enough samples to demonstrate the unusual properties of the material. His mind raced as he drove back to Roswell, rehearsing how he might explain to his commanding officer everything he had found. By the time he arrived at the base, the sun had begun to dip behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the runways. Marcel entered the intelligence office carrying the debris, and in that moment, the quiet chain of events that began on a stormy night at the Foster Ranch shifted into something far larger. When General Blanchard was briefed on the findings, he initially maintained the same assumption that governed the base's response to most civilian reports. He thought that the explanation must be something conventional. But as Marcel laid out the fragments on Blanchard's desk, the general's posture changed. He examined the foil, the beams, the unusual markings, and the impossibly lightweight components. He listened to Marcel's field observations, the details about the scattered wreckage, the shape-retaining metal, the absence of conventional construction features. Blanchard was not a man easily impressed, nor was he prone to speculation, but he recognized a simple fact. This material was unlike anything he had ever seen among standard military equipment, experimental or otherwise. Blanchard understood the importance of the 509th Bomb Group's reputation. As the commanding officer of the only nuclear bomber group on Earth, he was accustomed to dealing with matters of national significance. His responsibility was not just to Roswell, but to the strategic chain of command. When something unusual appeared on his desk, especially material that defied identification, his obligation was to control the situation and discover, as quickly as possible, exactly what they were dealing with here. In the hours that followed, Blanchard authorized recovery teams to secure the debris field and instructed Marcel to coordinate with other officers to transport the remaining material. At the same time, the general contacted higher command channels to report the situation. Although those communications were never fully disclosed to the public, the subsequent actions of the military suggest Blanchard's report triggered immediate interest well beyond the borders of Roswell. Orders were issued, shipments were prepared, and arrangements were quietly made for some of the debris to be flown to Fort Worth Army Airfield and possibly to Wright Field in Ohio, where foreign and experimental aircraft materials were examined by specialized analysts. Meanwhile, activity at the Roswell base increased noticeably. Soldiers were seen entering and exiting hangars, and trucks carrying sealed crates were observed by local residents. It became clear that something significant had occurred. In this period of heightened activity, additional testimonies emerged from personnel who claimed first-hand knowledge of what was being transported. One such testimony came from a woman who later stated that she had seen bodies brought to the Roswell base in early July. According to her account, she was threatened by military authorities and told never to speak of what she had witnessed. She described the beings as small, fragile, and decidedly not human, though she offered few details beyond those general impressions. Her story, like many emerging years afterwards, remains controversial, but it reflects a pattern of secrecy and intimidation that appears over and over in multiple accounts from people associated with this story. A second testimony from this period came from an anonymous doctor who claimed to have participated in medical examinations of non-human bodies at the base. His descriptions, delivered indirectly to researchers, suggested that the remains were treated with a level of urgency and confidentiality uncommon even for classified military operations. Though the doctor refused to reveal his identity publicly, his statements align with details provided by other witnesses who claim to have been exposed to aspects of the retrieval or autopsy of these beings. Then we have Master Sergeant Frank Kaufman, who who served at Walker Army Airfield, the nearest major installation to Roswell, and a facility with intelligence operations that intersected with those at the 509th. Kaufman claimed involvement in the retrieval of debris and alien bodies. His stories described materials that behaved strangely, security teams assigned to isolate witnesses, and an atmosphere of controlled urgency. Another striking account emerged from Frankie, the daughter of a firefighter who responded to the scene. According to her statements, she handled some of the debris as a child, pieces her father had shown her briefly before authorities confiscated them. Frankie remembered the material as metallic yet strangely lightweight, capable of returning to its original form when bent, once again providing corroboration with other witnesses to these materials. She also tells us that she was warned by a man in a dark suit described in many ways that would later evoke the Men in Black archetype. Speaking about the incident would result in severe consequences, he told her. We actually have audio of her speaking about this occurrence in later years. Let's listen to that now.
He had this club or stick or whatever it was, and he was beating it on his hand. And he would hit it. Every time he would say something, he'd hit his hand. And he said, I want you to know you were never there. And I didn't understand what he meant. Because I said, yes, I was. And he said, no, you weren't. I said, yes, I was. And he said, can't you get this through your head? You never saw anything. You were not there. You don't know anything. And he said, this is a big desert out here. We can just take you out in the middle of this desert and no one will ever find your bodies. He said, you'll be nothing but bones and nobody will ever know what happened to you. And I told him I would not talk about it.
How sincere does that sound? Right? Chilling. So this is an older lady who saw this stuff when she was a young kid, and you can tell whoever visited her made a serious impression, and it doesn't sound like she's making it up. Doesn't mean she isn't, but my personal opinion, sounds genuine. And credit where credit is due, that audio clip comes from This Paranormal Life, the podcast. I'm not sure where they got it from. I've searched around and couldn't find exactly that. So they have their sources, and I just wanted to give them a shout out. Thank you, Kit and Roy. Love you guys. And please don't sue me for using the audio that you got. Cheers. Such testimony was consistent with multiple accounts from people whose relatives encountered this debris. As these testimonies swirled around the events, some whispered in private. Others revealed decades later the official military operation continued in a more structured and visible manner. Major Jesse Marcel and his team completed their second, more thorough recovery mission and organized the transport of the primary debris to the Roswell Army Airfield. Once the material arrived at the base, it was sorted, examined, and prepared for shipment elsewhere. At the same time, Jesse Marcel briefed General Blanchard further, providing details from the field that only strengthened his conclusion that the wreckage was extraordinary. Marcel clearly emphasized that the material was unlike anything produced in the United States or any foreign power. General Blanchard, absorbing Marcel's report and examining the debris himself, recognized the gravity of the situation. Blanchard understood that an extraordinary situation required a clear and authoritative response. At the very least, the public would need to be reassured. At the most, higher authorities would need immediate notification. It was during this period, after Marcel returned with the debris, after initial shipments were arranged, and after the base experienced its surge in controlled activity, that Blanchard made the decision that would come to define the Roswell incident. He instructed Public Information Officer Walter Haut to prepare an official statement about this recovery. Haut's role was to communicate clearly, promptly and in coordination with the command structure of the 509th. What he was about to release would be the first public acknowledgement from a military installation regarding the material found on the Foster Ranch. Blanchard's directive was not issued casually. It came from the highest authority on the base, from a general accustomed to making decisions that carried national implications. In giving this order, he effectively shifted the Roswell incident from an internal investigation to a matter of public record. The significance of this decision cannot be overstated. Blanchard's involvement cemented the event's place within the military chain of command and ensured that whatever happened next would not remain a quiet local matter. By the time the press office prepared the announcement, the debris had already begun its journey into deeper levels of military classification. The material would soon leave Roswell under armed supervision, bound for analysis at Fort Worth and possibly Wright Field, where the Air Material Command examined experimental and foreign technologies. All of this represents the moment where the Roswell incident transitioned from a rural discovery to a military operation. This is the point where ranchers and sheriffs stepped aside, and intelligence officers, generals, and classified protocols took over. The testimonies from civilians who witnessed strange cargo, unusual activity, or intimidating warnings add texture to the story and reveal how swiftly the machinery of secrecy moves into place. What happened next would become one of the most famous and controversial moments in the history of American military communication. And it began with Blanchard's simple but world-shifting directive to his communication officer. Prepare the statement. File 5. The official communique. Morning came softly to Roswell, New Mexico on July 8, 1947. The sun crept over the desert horizon, washing the town in that pale golden light that made even the quiet streets look warm and alive. Kids hurried down sidewalks with lunch pails. Shopkeepers lifted metal shutters and swept yesterday's dust out of their doorways. Retired couples lingered on front porches with full coffee cups warming their hands, watching the neighborhood slowly wake up. Milk bottles clinked, screen doors squeaked, and radios hummed with the usual morning chatter. Everything about the day felt ordinary. No one suspected that anything unusual was coming. They had no reason to. On the residential streets, young paper boys pedaled hard and threw tightly rolled newspapers onto driveways and porches. A few landed perfectly. A few bounced off the steps and thudded harmlessly into flower beds. The sounds of those deliveries blended with chirping birds and distant train whistles. Roswell was waking up. People opened their doors, bent down, and picked up the morning edition without a second thought. They carried it inside along with their usual assumptions about the world, that everything worked the way it always had, that the government was steady and predictable, and that these strange new reports of flying discs from here or there that were sweeping the country were nothing more than tall tales carried on summer winds. Somewhere in a kitchen, a man unfolded the newspaper while his wife scrambled eggs on the stove. Somewhere else, a teenager glanced at the front page before heading out to work in the fields. Across town, an older couple adjusted their glasses as they smoothed the creases of their newspaper copy across the breakfast table. And then, in living rooms, kitchens, cafes, barbershops, and all the once quiet corners of Roswell, New Mexico, a bold statement stared back at them from the front page of the Roswell Daily Record, an established newspaper with an unshakable reputation. The source, an army general and his soldiers, and a shocking, impossible headline presented in the unblinking confidence of black ink on newsprint. RAAF captures flying saucer on ranch in Roswell region. What happened next is a story for the Roswell UFO Incident Part 2, which you can catch right here next Wednesday. Next Wednesday. Thank you sincerely for diving deep into the Roswell UFO Incident Part 1 with me, and we are only halfway done. Tune in next week to find out what happened with this revelation, the press conference that followed, and all of the ways this story brings us to our modern disclosure frameworks where the powers that be still seem to duck and dodge the realist questions and answers about all the strange things we see in the skies. Tap follow right now on the app you're listening with so we can meet here next Wednesday to investigate Part 2 of the Roswell crash. If you liked this episode and the hundreds more I've made and given to you for free, then you can help me keep this independent show going by joining the Renegade Files agency on Patreon. It hardly costs a thing. You can try it for free for a whole week to check it out. Your support there directly fuels the production costs of this show, so we can explore these mysteries together. Every new RFA agent on Patreon gets bonus content and more. But more than that, you become part of the small crew of dedicated listeners who make this work possible. If you believe in digging deeper, questioning the narrative, and keeping truth alive, visit patreon.com/renegadefiles. There's a link in the show notes. Become an RFA agent today. And to those of you already supporting the show there, thank you so much. You make this mission possible. I am so glad to have you in the Renegade Files crew. I'm your host, Lex Gordon. I'll see you next time for the Roswell UFO Incident Part 2. Stay wild, gypsy child.